and good morning. Hello to everyone on the webinar this morning. Thanks for joining us. This is, of course, a very hot topic, Guyana and what's going on there. It's regionally one of the hottest topics, and internationally it's becoming more and more so every day. I'm very, very grateful and excited to have Arnold McIntyre with me today to discuss what's happening in Guyana. Arnold is the IMF's Mission Chief to Guyana. He's also a fellow Caribbean national. He's from Grenada. And this, of course, gives him even closer ties and insight into the implications of what oil production means, not just for Guyana, but also for the region. And Arnold and his team just concluded the Article 4 consultation on Guyana, and their reports were published recently. And they forecasted GDP growth of 86% in 2020 for Guyana. I mean, that kind of figure, when you read it in an Article 4 report, your first instinct is to say, oh, that's a typo. They must mean 8.6, not 86. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Arnold. I'm so excited, and I'm very grateful that you've agreed to spend some time with us today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. And let me first of all say we are very grateful to you for the opportunity to have an exchange on Guyana. As you correctly said, we've just published our Article 4 staff report where our views are clearly spelled out there. This is a potentially very exciting time for Guyana in the region. So I think it's an opportune moment to have such a discussion.
Indeed, indeed. Thanks, Arnold. And so the first question that I want to throw at you is around what's going to be happening in Guyana with respect to oil production and what that means for economic growth. I remember looking at the numbers that Trinidad produced at its peak, and Guyana will be producing 2 or 3 times in the next few years what Trinidad produced at its peak in, I think, 1978. It was 200 and something thousand barrels a day. And so it's really mind-boggling to think, because I'm from Trinidad and I know what it meant for us, and to think Guyana, which is a smaller population and starting from a lower base, if you will be producing multiple times what Trinidad produced at its peak. Tell us from your perspective, what are the implications, and what is the oil production going to look like, and what are the implications for economic growth for Guyana?
Well, our staff report is based on 2 finds, LISA 1 and LISA 2. Mm-hmm. Don't need to underscore the point that the medium-term outlook for Guyana is extremely favorable. Oil production will start in Q1 2020. LISA 1 is about 120,000 barrels a day. And in 2022, LISA 2 is expected to come on stream. That would add another 220,000 barrels for around 340,000 barrels. There are other finds that we know exist that will come on stream as well over the next 5-7 years and so on, that will add to annual oil production. Best estimates we have from the companies involved is that the current size of the oil sector in Guyana is or recoverable oil, as they say, is around 6 billion barrels, which makes Guyana a fairly significant medium-sized oil producer. One must always remember that this is on a population of about 780,000 people. This is a very small population. Mm-hmm. You point to the staggering GDP growth number in 2020. Well, part of that is really a statistical inflection, because the national accounts in Guyana are currently being rebased from a base of 2006 to 2012, and the coverage has been expanded to include oil as well. Oil was capital formation around oil and hiring of labor, what we call in field value added, was starting since 2015, but the national accounts wasn't calculating that. So if you look at 2019, you would see oil production is 0. And then if you look in 2020, you see it's a big number. So therefore, 2019 to 2020, the real growth is very substantial, and that blew up the GDP. Okay. But this does not remove from the fact that GDP is going to grow very substantially in Guyana. In fact, by about 2024, 24, oil is going to be around 40% of GDP. So per capita income and nominal GDP are going to be very substantial. The purposes of our discussions was to, first of all, understand and get a reasonable hold on what the trajectory for oil production was going to be, and assumptions around prices and so on. And then the Natural Resource Fund that has been brought into legislation by the government. We thought this was a very positive step forward for Guyana. It lays out very clearly an emphasis on intertemporal savings for future generations to benefit from oil. It establishes strong transparency principles and arrangements for reporting on oil revenues and the use of the oil revenues. Under the Natural Resource Fund, oil revenues will go into a sovereign wealth fund type structure, which will be held offshore. And then the Natural Resource Fund legislation spells out a fiscal transfer rule from the fund to the budget. In essence, the target is that the long term, they estimate the long term value of the NRF, that the transfer should be about 3% of the long term value of the NRF. But there's a very clear fiscal transfer rule. We like that structure. We think that's appropriate. It's consistent with some of the other major oil producers as well. What we were keen to have discussions with the government on and made proposals on, and we had very good discussions both at the Central Bank and at the Ministry of Finance Minister Jordan, Sonia Rupnath and the team there. What we wanted to do is to develop a complementary fiscal framework which would try to do a couple of things. One, we have to recognize that Guyana has very significant development needs. For example, if you look at the human capital metrics for Guyana, the Guyana's human capital is lower than the median for the Caribbean and its income group as well. Guyana's human capital index is 0.49, the Caribbean's median is 0.5. In particular, if you look at education, children in Guyana can expect to complete 12.1 years of primary, pre-primary, primary, and secondary school education by age 18. But when years of schooling are adjusted for the quality of learning, it is only equivalent to 6.7 years. So there's a learning gap of about 5.4. Similar kinds of metrics can be produced in the areas of health and social sectors. And of course, there's a large infrastructure gap in Guyana. So one cannot underscore the importance of ramping up both capital and current spending to address these critical development needs. What the minister and his team were very keen about, and which we shared, is that this should not result in what is typically known as the oil curse or Dutch disease, where spending is ramped up at such a rapid pace that it produces very high level rates of inflation, which undermine real exchange rate and competitiveness and cause significant macroeconomic distortions. So what we tried to do is to come up with a fiscal target that preserves the positive features of the Natural Resource Fund, which is the savings elements and so on, and at the same time allows Guyana to meet its critical development needs. To do so, we did like we do in other cases, the fiscal balance to be looked at or to be monitored would be the fiscal deficit as a percentage of non-oil GDP, okay? Non-oil fiscal deficit as non-oil GDP. And what we then said is that today, Guyana's fiscal deficit is non-oil GDP because there's no oil yet. And the deficit has been around 5% of GDP over the last few years, which is quite appropriate, we think, for low-income, emerging lower middle-income country. So what we then said is that, look, to achieve that fiscal deficit, to achieve the ramping up of spending, what is the expansion in the fiscal stance that is permissible that will not produce distortionary macroeconomic outcomes, Dutch disease type effects? And we felt that if we constrain the fiscal deficit such that the overall fiscal balance could be constrained to zero, such that the transfers coming from the Natural Resource Fund every year would be equal to the non-oil fiscal deficit. That would give you a zero balance.
Oh, okay.
That
makes sense.
When we did that, we said, well, over what period of time should they be? And we figured that they could achieve this over 2 to 3 years. When we looked at that, that allows the non-oil fiscal deficit to increase in a measured way from around 5% of GDP to around 8% of GDP by 2024, which is a fairly expansionary fiscal stance. We have analytical tools here at the fund, which we then looked at what that path of public investment, that path of fiscal spending, what will it do to inflation, what would it crowd out private sector investment, et cetera, et cetera. And we found that those impacts would be rather minimal, or at least could be contained. And therefore, that is the fiscal frame, medium-term fiscal framework we discussed with government, and we had broad agreement that this was how they should go. And as I say, there was a lot of preoccupation in the part of the Guyana team on not having the macro distortions. Complementary to that, we discussed with the central bank a monetary framework, a monetary and exchange rate policy framework that would be supportive of that, to ensure that inflation and price stability would be the focus. And we have quite a bit of technical assistance going to be delivered to the Bank of Guyana over the next year or two at the request of the governor to help them develop the architecture of the monetary policy framework to support that, which would include some degree of exchange rate flexibility to, because to be able to allow Guyana to have buffers and respond to oil price shocks. The final element that we discussed around this, Marla, would be what would be to look at what are some of the major impediments to growth. We discussed the need to address infrastructure, particularly transportation networks, improve the quality and generation of electricity. But a key issue is the supply of skilled labor. Guyana
that skills gap.
In the Western Hemisphere, Guyana is the 5th or 6th or 7th country, the highest immigration rate over the last 20 years. And a lot of the immigration has been of skilled persons. So the shortage of skilled labor was not only undermining is undermining the growth effort and the growth strategy in Guyana. But perhaps I should stop rambling on and more can come out in the Q&A.
Yeah, no, I on that last point, I think even just yesterday I was at a conference here and talking about the skills gap in Barbados, and I did mention that in Guyana. I do recall a policymaker in Guyana, I can't remember who, talking about that there is some element of brain gain happening where you have people from the Guyanese diaspora coming back, because there are economic opportunities now that had not existed prior. To what extent are you seeing some of that, though, some brain gain, whether the diaspora or whether non-nationals or non-diaspora from Guyana?
Well, there was, particularly when we spoke to the private sector, they did point out that there's a fairly open labor market policy in Guyana. They don't find that there are restrictions or rigidities in their way in terms of hiring labor that they may need for private sector and other activities.
Okay.
And the government there is obviously contemplating, and I suspect will move for a very open immigration policy, which is what we suggested to them towards CARICOM, allowing all categories of workers to move. But when you look at the fact that you're going to have about a 40% addition to GDP in about 3 or 4 years, already you see that the housing and construction sector in Guyana is growing quite substantially. There's a lot of oil workers that have to be accommodated, a lot of economic activity around oil that has to be accommodated. The demand for skilled labor from accounts clerks to all kinds of skills, IT specialists and so on, is going to be very substantial.
Right.
Whether that can be entirely met from CARICOM or not, we will see.
Indeed. So another thing that struck me is, despite the amount of fiscal revenue that's going to be coming into Guyana from the oil sector, what are your thoughts on whether or not Guyana will be looking to borrow? I mean, they haven't issued bonds in a very long time, and I know coming out of the IMF's heavily indebted poor country program that existed, when was that? Maybe the 1980s or so, yes. If memory serves me correct. There was a restriction on bond issuance and commercial sovereign borrowing. What are your thoughts on that? Will they need to? Will they want to? How do you feel?
Well, first of all, I'm not aware that the HIPIC initiative they're still restricted. I'll have to check that, but I'm not aware. But one of the key features of the fiscal framework, medium-term fiscal framework we discussed with the government, was that this would allow them to ramp up spending while driving down debt. So if you look at our tables, you will see debt goes from about 56, 57, 58% of GDP in 2019 to about 19 or 20% of GDP over 5 years. While at the same time they're ramping up spending and they're having savings. The flow of oil revenues from the sovereign wealth fund to the budget is going to be quite substantial. So Guyana is going to be able to pay down a lot of its debt. And the investment path and the spending path we've agreed can be fully financed by oil. So
Okay.
there is no need to accumulate debt over the medium to long term, really. I mean, and it's not uncommon for oil producers that have a significant find a small population to drive their debt down to zero, actually.
Right, right. Well, that's good to know. I would hope that that's indeed the trajectory that they stay on. What about the production sharing agreements? What can you tell us about the fund's view on those?
Well, the production sharing agreement Guyana has is not atypical. It's quite consistent with what a number of other countries have. You know, the initial thing is to allow the companies who take the risk and spend large sums of money in the exploration and so on, to allow them a reasonable period for cost recovery. And
Right.
in Guyana's, in that period, therefore, a lot of the oil revenues do go back to the companies to compensate them for the risk and then to allow them to recover costs. And then you decide what is called profit oil. And in Guyana, that profit oil is shared 50-50. So in the period of cost recovery, Guyana gets about 12.5% of the 25% profit oil, and then 2% royalty, which is 14.5%. And by the way, there's a mistake in the table we have in our staff report when we try to look at the present value, because we look at the present value over the entire life of the project, which is from sort of 2020 to 2048, Lisa 1, Lisa 2. And the distribution is about 14.5% in the period of the investment coverage, is about 7 years. And after that, it becomes far more even, and therefore Guyana's share of the oil revenues, present value terms and nominal terms, goes up quite substantially. So I would say that there's nothing atypical here. Some countries have a little bit more in terms of the share in the investment recovery period. Some have a little bit less. But the important thing is that the share that Guyana gets of the oil revenues after the initial investment phase goes up quite substantially, and therefore the returns to the country are very significant.
I'm glad to hear that, because I remember there were lots of rumblings in the initial stages that perhaps Guyana was not getting the best deal, and there were some reports written and so on. So I'm happy to hear that it's not as bad as it might have been initially discussed.
These things, you know, don't want to insert myself in that discussion, but these things are always very difficult. You know, you have a country that finds a very substantial resource, dealing with a large international company that's coming with all the technology and that kind of thing. But look, I think, you know, the arrangement is in place. The focus for Guyana now has to be on ensuring that the returns that it's going to get, which are very substantial indeed, are used efficiently to raise living standards and the level of development in Guyana, and that has to be the focus. Future, I know the Guyanese authorities, which we say in our staff report, are very concerned about ring fencing, so that future oil agreements, they would look at that, but that's for them to do, and they're well aware.
With respect to the Dutch disease, now I have a joke to give you with respect to Dutch disease. So once I was talking to the then Dutch ambassador in Trinidad, and we talked about Guyana and we talked about Dutch disease. He says, hang on. I take offense, because we don't have any Dutch disease anymore. So this is like not Dutch anymore. This is like, and I quite agree with him, you know, and I wrote it in my report recently. We shouldn't be calling this Dutch disease anymore. We need to rebrand this. It has to be like Trinidadian disease or Nigerian disease or even Venezuelan disease. But you talked a lot about, you know, the Sovereign Wealth Fund and managing the non-oil fiscal deficit and the non-oil GDP and keeping that ratio at a certain level so that we don't, unlike Trinidad, for example, get to a point where you have a huge non-oil fiscal deficit. What other mechanisms, and I know that the way in which we can redistribute the income and raise living standards is through fiscal spending. But what are the mechanisms and the reforms that the fund is recommending and hopefully that the authorities will adopt, whether the current administration or whoever wins the next election in March of next year? What are the recommended policy reforms to contain the Dutch disease effects, and also to avoid the pitfalls of the spending of you know, fiscal revenue that comes from oil, that then has the potential to create a certain expectation and well, not just the crowding out, but where the economy gets used to a certain amount of fiscal spending. What are the recommended policies? I know you've discussed some to avoid this kind of a trap.
Well, one of the key things is that when you look at how the path of spending, not only for Guyana, but other oil countries, a lot of it goes into public investment, closing infrastructure gaps. Guyana is a very large country. So right. there's a lot of difficulties in connectivity between the sort of hinterland and the sort of coast of Georgetown and so on. So that the transportation networks, electricity generation and supply, these things are large, lumpy investments. So the public investment management function is key. And we did a public investment management assessment, what we call a PIMA for Guyana in 2017, which made certain specific recommendations, which the government is working on now. One of them, for example, is by 2020, they should have a transparent rules-based fiscal framework that clearly spells out targets for capital spending. Then they should have a complete and publish a policy framework for public-private partnerships, et cetera, et cetera. The key issue here is transparency and, importantly, evidence-based investment decisions. The rigorous cost-benefit analysis that provides good analytical frameworks for choosing between different investments and prioritizing those investments, and ensuring that you stay within the targets of the medium-term fiscal framework for public investment and you don't exceed them. So therefore, that institutional strengthening is taking place. Again, skilled labor is an issue here because you have to have the skills within the public sector and the Ministry of Finance and others to be able to do that type of analysis. The accountants, the engineers, and that kind of. Another very important plank in this that is complementary to the fiscal framework is the whole question of the governance arrangements.
Yes.
We spent quite a bit of time, as you see in the staff report, looking at this issue. For example, the public procurement function. And we met with the tenders board, which is responsible for receiving bids on government contracts and so on. We also met with the Public Procurement Commission, which is the oversight body of the tenders board. We found the persons there very committed, had a very clear work program, but again, don't have sufficient people and skilled people to discharge the function as efficiently as they would want to. You look on the financial sector side, addressing issues of money laundering, which can arise with these big, large flows. And the financial, and then the whole question of Guyana's commitment to the UN Convention on Corruption around the asset declaratory regime. The government has revitalized the Integrity Commission. They have completed about just over 50% of the asset declarations of about 1,200 public officials. They intend to try and complete the rest. They're constrained by lack of skills, and they also need to verify these things. So transparency and accountability around the public officials responsible and deeply involved in the management of oil wealth, and also including the politically exposed persons, and also the strengthening the institutional capacity of the Ministry of Finance and others to undertake large public investment functions, as well as the line ministries, is important. Therefore, in the initial years of oil wealth, it's important not to ramp up too fast and get caught up in white elephants and bad spending. Give yourself time while you're addressing people's needs, because people have real needs in Guyana. While you're addressing people's needs, give yourself time to build the capacity that you need. And some of that is going to have to come from foreign expertise, CARICOM and otherwise.
Wow, I'm happy to hear that the governance is strengthening. I know that that's a concern I've heard a lot of people voice with respect to, is this money going to translate into better outcomes, social outcomes for the Guyanese citizens now in the short term as well as in the longer term? And the answer to that question is around institutional strengthening and governance and transparency being a large part of it. And so I'm happy to hear that they're making strides. I saw that in very early stages they got onto the EITI.
That's right. We met with that unit too, and they have done their first report and so on. Look, we did not find any lack of commitment on the part of the government to strengthening the governance apparatus. And when we met with the opposition party, we heard very similar sentiments expressed there as well.
Okay.
The governance apparatus is critical, and it's not only the increases in nominal incomes that is going to be important to the Guyanese population. Obviously, that is important. People want to have more money, disposable income, but it's going to be improving access to and quality of education and health. That's going to be very critical, as we see from the development needs in Guyana. You will also notice that, you see, it's one thing when you have this booming energy sector, but it's going to feed into the non-tradable sector, the housing, the construction, the commercial activity around that. As Guyanese incomes increase very substantially and people have more disposable income to buy goods and services, those have to be supplied. So the public sector is going to be competing for labor with the private sector as well. So and you have to ensure that you keep a look on productivity and that people's productivity are going up, and the way to do that is to ensure they get better training, higher quality training, and so on. It is a very difficult task to manage these competing objectives, and ourselves and our partners in the World Bank, in the American Development Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank are all willing to support Guyana in what they're doing, we also try to do that by speaking to other stakeholders. I speak to the unions, I speak to the private sector to get their views on these things. But the vigilance of the stakeholders in Guyana is very strong. So the government
really, that's good to hear.
Very
that's
strong,
good to
strong.
hear.
I found the stakeholders when I interacted with them, both public and private sector, but for both private sector and unions and others, very knowledgeable about their own country, very clear views on what they think is important. A common thread was the management of the oil revenues, ensuring that the people of Guyana benefit from this, an openness to welcome back Guyanese from the diaspora. A lot of people expressed that and hoping that would happen, and also an openness to welcome persons from the rest of CARICOM to who might seek and find employment opportunities and business opportunities in Guyana.
That's good to hear. I'm happy to hear that, and very excited. I mean, Guyana is one of my very favorite places on earth, especially the interior. Love it there. I think now maybe the time for us to switch to taking some questions from our audience, which Melissa will send our way.
To start off, I'm kind of consolidating some of the questions. So those of you that are sending in questions, just please understand that I might not ask it in your same exact words. Arnold, people would like to know, how do you see the existing regional oil infrastructure? How can it help develop the industry, such as the infrastructure that exists in Curacao or Aruba, Suriname, next door in Trinidad or in Venezuela?
I feel a little less qualified to speak about oil infrastructure. What I would say is that I believe the government is collaborating, particularly with Trinidad and Tobago, in understanding, in getting some assistance from them. And I've only heard about that in sort of public statements made on either side. But I think what we tried to do, and I think is to point out, we have a box in an annex in our staff report about mistakes other countries made. I mean, when Trinidad got into oil in the 1970s, they say hindsight is perfect foresight. The Trinidadians didn't really have a lot to draw on when they came in there. There's a much larger body of knowledge available to everyone now. But I still think that the Trinidadians would tell you about their own experiences, what they thought they did right, what mistakes they did make. The Ghanaians also have been to Guyana. I was the resident representative for the IMF in Ghana when they found oil. And I was very intimately involved in discussions about how they were going to manage oil and that kind of thing. And I think one of the case of Ghana tells you that the whole question of the transparency and the whole question of not borrowing in advance of oil revenues, which is what the Ghanaians did, and driving up debt. These are some of the lessons that we learned. But in terms of the specifics about how the oil infrastructure in the other region can assist Guyana, I'm really not the person to ask that. I don't have the kind of knowledge.
Yeah, I know that there is an MOU between the energy chamber in Trinidad and I believe the Guyanese government, or the equivalent in Guyana. but most of their, I mean, if not all of their oil is going to be offshore and deep water, as far as I understand. And so, I mean, a lot of the existing infrastructure is being brought in and floating, not so, Arnold? So I
That's
don't
right, yes.
know. I don't know that the neighboring countries' infrastructure. Maybe they probably mean the question is probably directed towards refinery. Can you talk a little bit about that as to whether I know there has been a discussion around whether or not to put a refinery up in Guyana, but given that you have so much refining capacity in Venezuela that has deteriorated and could probably be improved, you have an refining capacity in Aruba that is idle, and then now in Trinidad. I don't know to what extent it makes sense for Guyana to have a refinery. What are your thoughts, Arnold?
Well, actually, the authorities never expressed any intention either when we met with the Ministry of Energy, the Energy Unit in the Presidency, or the Ministry of Finance.
Right.
The issue of a refinery just never came up.
Okay.
If it's in their plans, doesn't seem to be certainly in their near-term and medium-term plans. And when we met with the oil companies, it didn't come up either.
Okay, so then that's probably not on the cards, which is probably a good thing, just from my very general knowledge. Okay, next question, please.
Looking at the banking sector, what have you heard as far as developments in the banking sector? Are more foreign banks expected to enter? Is there lending capacity in the local market? And how prepared is the local banking sector for this level of development?
Well, in our staff report, we talk about the issue of the financial stability issues. The non-performing loans in Guyana are still on general a little bit high, but it's concentrated in one or two banks. It's not across the sector. We have made a recommendation that maybe, given that the credit demand and credit supply is likely to go up quite substantially over the medium to long term, they may want to do an asset quality review of some of the banks to try and strengthen balance sheets and so on in advance of that. You hear, I think there is great interest of other banks entering the Guyana market. That I'm pretty sure of. And we also talked about the issue of financial inclusion. They have made some progress with the establishment of credit bureaus and that kind of thing. The challenges here is that growth in credit and growth in financial sector development is likely to be very rapid. And as I pointed out, when we were there, for example, residential mortgages for the first 4 months of 2019, relative to the same period in 2018, had gone up by 16%. Now that's a substantial increase in residential mortgages. A lot of it is private sector individuals and companies building out residential homes for the oil workers and people around the oil sector. So we expect fully that the credit demand is going to expand as growth expands. The Central Bank of Guyana does receive a fair amount of technical assistance from CARTAC on strengthening their regulation and supervisory capacity. The governor and his team are very keen to build that out even further. Together, while they will be getting technical assistance from our monetary and capital markets development around the monetary policy framework and exchange rate policy. So we think that but again, you're talking about getting more skilled people. We think that there's no lack of understanding of the challenges ahead in this area of the financial sector development. It's for the central bank now to be able to access the people it needs to discharge an enhanced role.
I agree, and I think I saw that Scotia is likely to stay in Guyana, even though they were exiting some other markets in the region, and so it's obvious that they recognize the outlook and the role that plays in how well they're likely to do there. What about financial inclusion in general? I mean, it's one thing to have growth and credit of the existing customer base. I know that there is a challenge around financial inclusion in Guyana. Do you see or hear the authorities, because this is a key element of poverty reduction and also of gender equality, by the way, because women are more likely to be financially excluded than men. And more likely to be members of the informal sector. Was there any strategy discussed, and is there any plan around financial inclusion and boosting that in Guyana?
Yes, in addition to the credit bureau and that kind of thing, and providing credit information to a wider range of the private sector, so people can increase access. Specifically on the female, we discussed with the authorities the female labor force participation rate, okay. which has not really improved in recent years, but the authority, the government does recognize that this is an issue that they have to put targets around and have targeted policies towards. But you might think, one might think, you know, as you get more as you get more banks, as you get more entrance into the financial sector, and you get more competition and a wider variety of products and services being offered, this in itself can result in many more people, you know, getting integrated into the financials and, you know, financial inclusion expanding. It's not going to just happen naturally, but you know, as you say, there should be a strategy, and they are working on that. Okay. And we stand ready to help them in that way.
Okay.
Look at ATMs and the expansion of ATMs and accounts and all that kind of thing.
That's good to know. Okay, Melissa, next question, please.
What do you see are the main risks to the oil windfalls actually reaching the Guyanese consumers?
Well, the risks around the oil windfall is basically if you ramp up spending too rapidly and you get the macroeconomic distortions, inflation can be your devil. So that, you know, if you start getting double-digit inflation, you'll be undermining purchasing power and disposable incomes of the individuals and of the country generally. So a key charge, as we discussed before, a key objective has to be to contain inflationary pressures, while at the same time increasing spending to meet development needs and to improve people's standards of living. That's the difficult balance you have to be able to manage, and that's what we try to assist in terms of our medium-term fiscal framework, and to support that, a monetary policy and exchange rate policy that's laser focused on price stability. If we can achieve that and contain inflation, people will see improvements in real living standards over the period of time, or in the medium to long term.
Okay.
Arnold, what do you feel that Guyana can learn from the errors of other economies like Trinidad, so that they truly do diversify and transform their economy? What would a strategy look like to ensure that the non-oil sector would continue to grow and to develop, especially taking into account the skills gap that you've referred to and the human resources that are required to ensure this type of outcome?
A very good question.
Good question.
Is to ensure that the non-oil economy continues to expand. And here, one cannot sit on one's laurels. You have to continue to pursue the structural reforms. You have to continue to improve the business environment, improve the
ease of doing business,
registrations and licenses. You know, throughout the Caribbean, there is a real challenge between the interface between the public sector and the private sector in the whole question of economic regulations. The length of time it gets to get registrations done, licenses, approvals, and so on, that tends to be very lengthy bureaucratic delays, which improve the efficiency and increase transactions costs for businesses. So Guyana cannot take its eye off those things. The doing business indicators provide a rough guide as to where you are with that, so that can be a broad indicator that they can follow. And a lot of these things in the Caribbean generally need to be now IT-based rather than paper-based. A lot of the public sector in the Caribbean is still very paper-based. And therefore, the investments Guyana needs to make to modernize its public service, as do other Caribbean countries, to modernize public service, improve the efficiency and delivery of these services, goes a long way towards improving the quality of the business environment and the competitiveness. In addition to that, the education and training institutions, improving the quality of those constantly over time, would help you to ensure that productivity levels don't decline, but more importantly, do increase. So the quality of skilled labor you're putting out there, and it's not only a matter of, you know, training younger people, it's ensuring that you continue to train your society at all levels, you know, in IT technology and these things that are so vital for efficient business. If Guyana maintains a very concerted and sustained effort around structural reforms and improving the the quality of the local environment for business and for workers and so on, and improving people's skills, as we say, and so on. That is going to be vital to expanding the non-oil economy. If you take your eye off the ball and don't address those things, you become a monoculture. You have one booming sector, but the rest of the economy is largely inefficient. And that sector is largely driven by a resource in the ground. It's not driven by anything else. So that is the message that we try to convey, because it's not only growth, it's important that you get inclusive growth.
Exactly.
It's very, very essential. And at the same time, things like income inequality are, where it exists, addressed. A couple of colleagues and myself are now trying to do a study on this whole issue of income inequality in the Caribbean over the last 20, 30 years. Where does it exist? The initial results point out that incomes in the Caribbean are quite unequal, and therefore what has driven that and what can be done about that. And with the onset of oil, as Marla was saying, Guyana has an opportunity now to address some of these things and have much more inclusive growth.
Arnold, when I look at Trinidad and the impact that the energy sector has had on the non-energy sector, really the non-energy sector is driven a lot by fiscal spending, which of course is, substantially derived from the energy sector. And you're right that, ease of doing business and those types of reforms that are focused on ease of doing business are important to keeping the non-energy sector, vibrant, as well as education and productivity and so on. But a key element in Trinidad that has affected negatively the non-energy sector is an overvalued currency. Can you tell us a bit about the mechanism in Guyana to avoid that happening?
Very good question. I mean, one of the things that one has to be concerned about when you have these large inflows of foreign exchange coming through the oil is whether how far the exchange rate will appreciate. Now, you may appreciate some degree of exchange rate appreciation to contain inflationary pressures, but you don't want that to happen at the expense of competitiveness over the medium to long term.
Exactly.
That's why we are working with the central bank to come up with a monetary policy and exchange rate policy framework that allows us the Guyana to respond to volatile oil prices, the shocks that come from that. When the commodity cycle is on the upside, when it's on the downside, what degree of flexibility do you permit, while at the same time ensuring that you have achieving some reasonable rate of inflation or inflation band,
and stability.
Develop your financial markets, your money markets, and so on. So those are the kinds of things that we have discussed with them, and where our technical assistance will go over the next 2 to 3 years. I want to make one point just about the previous question. One of the things that struck me in my discussions with Minister Jordan, he was very proud to tell me that about Guyana's efforts in renewable energy.
Yes.
Very proud to tell me that although they had this windfall of oil, that they had initiatives in wind and mini hydro plants and so on, which they can because of their water resources and so on. So, and that they had a strategy around that, and the development of renewable energy in Guyana, while at the same time having fairly substantial amounts of petroleum. Take your eye off the ball of everything. Renewable energy is going to be very essential as well.
Of course. And the thing about the oil, I mean, it's volatile in terms of price as well, and unpredictable largely, even though everybody tries to predict it. So better to insulate yourself as best as possible from it in any event. So I'm happy to hear that they're still pursuing that avenue, which I think many oil producers have not done a good job at. Trinidad is prime example, has not done a good job of promoting renewable energy at all. So I'm happy to hear that Guyana is still focused on that. Melissa, next question, please.
Actually, before we get away from the topic of renewable energy, there are some questions around, how is Guyana preparing for the development of renewable energy? What's your sense in terms of, is there room for private capital investment in renewable energy? Are there supportive government policies being developed to support this? If you could just comment on that.
Well, they are looking at the power purchase agreements and the arrangements people do for net metering and that kind of thing to allow renewable energy suppliers to supply the electricity grid. They are doing that. There are some mini hydro projects, I think, in the planning stages, because hydro is perhaps the cheapest, one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest source of energy there is, not to mention how clean it is. So there is a policy framework being developed around renewable energy for Guyana. It's important that those efforts are sustained and developed while at the same time, seeking to manage the petroleum industry. I cannot tell you much more about that. What I do know is that the next time, one of the things we are planning to do is to take a little bit closer look at this whole question of renewable energy, CO2 emissions, but also the whole question of climate change. The rest of the Caribbean is subject to a lot of severe natural disasters, and the incidence of those disasters and the strength of those storms has been increasing. So a lot of our dialogue with the rest of the Caribbean has been around that, building resilience. We'll probably take a closer look at that in Guyana the next time we are there, because sea level rise and so on is a very important thing for Guyana. So we would be looking at sort of climate change effects as well.
Isn't Georgetown below sea level?
I think so, yes. And therefore, one of the things that we were discussing with the government was pointing out to us is that this, which I never knew before, and it's quite surprising actually. The European Union is assisting them with is the development of mangroves across the line, because the mangroves slow down the soil erosion in the sea. Now it's aesthetically not particularly attractive to look at all these mangroves, but they have a project doing that now, and they are addressing that, and they intend to intensify those efforts. So when we had our board discussion at the fund here, the number of directors were interested in what Guyana was doing to address climate change type effects.
Very good to know.
We have a lot of folks from the CARICOM region on the call, and there's a lot of questions coming in about how do you see that the rest of the region is really going to benefit from these developments in Guyana. If you could just both make some comments on that, please.
Well, just simply the share, as we talked about, you have a very strong growing economy. I would think the most immediate channel would be the demand for labor. That would be the most immediate channel. I mean, from that would take place. And Guyana, I think, is committed to a very liberal immigration policy with the rest of CARICOM. So, people of different various levels of skills and so on, artisans, construction people, artisans, through to accountants, legal clerks, law, a variety of skills. As we said, that those demands will come from the private sector. They will come from a variety of public sector institutions. As Guyana slowly and steadily, systematically strengthens its public institutions, its private sector involvement in the economy deepens as the economy grows. The demand for labor services will go up quite substantially, up to managerial levels. And as I said, in discussions with the private sector, in the various fora they are very open to bringing in the people that they require. So that would be one obvious channel. And of course, Guyana's own economic growth will generate demand for goods and services from the rest of the Caribbean, which would help businesses in the rest of the Caribbean. So the growth spillovers from Guyana to the rest of the region, particularly those countries very close to the rest of the region, will be very substantial. But I would think from the discussion we have been having, the labor channel, the labor market channel will be a very, very critical one.
I would agree with you. You know what also occurred to me? You know that Jamaica has had one of the best performing, if not the best performing stock exchange in the world recently, right? And I just thought that, Guyana's stock exchange has languished from my understanding, my read of it. And perhaps in the next few years, Guyana's stock exchange might be one that, can be attractive to the rest of the region, just as Jamaica has been over the past couple of years. And that might be one mechanism via which the rest of the region can benefit from Guyana's growth. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see any uptick in activity for the publicly traded companies there, or do you think that that's not going to happen? What are your thoughts?
No, I don't think it might be an immediate thing, but down the road, I think, these private institutions that evolve as you get a modern market economy, they will develop. As the economy develops, as the companies, the private sector expands, you will get a stronger stock exchange, and you will get interest from the rest of the region in that.
More activity for sure.
That's right. Guyana will be a growth pole for the rest of the Caribbean. It's big enough. The expansion in GDP is going to be large enough that it will spill over to the rest of the Caribbean. It's to ensure that the management of the oil wealth is done so that it doesn't distort Guyana's economy and limits its ability to spill over to the rest of the Caribbean. And secondly, to ensure that they are not impediments or restrictions that negatively impact those growth spillovers. I fully expect that businesses and labor will benefit from forging greater linkages with Guyana. There's no question about that. And Trinidad is very close, Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Barbados, but I expect it to go right up the train, because if you're growing at that kind of level, and 40% oil is going to be 40% of GDP in 2024. Oil is 0% of GDP today, and it's 40% of GDP in 2024. You're talking about a very sharp growth trajectory, and that's just on the basis of the two finds. We know that there are other Payala and other fields that have come on board. In fact, within the last month, both Exxon and Tullow announced additional finds. So don't want to overblow this, but this is very significant.
Yeah, before we go to the other questions, Melissa, I have a question. I mean, when I was last in Guyana, I think it was last year, heard a lot of Spanish on the streets of Georgetown. Did you, and is your team aware of any possible negative implications? I know Guyana needs skilled labor, but obviously there's been quite a bit of flow of migrants from Venezuela. Do you have any sense of whether there'll be negative spillovers from that?
Well, we looked specifically into the question of the spillovers from Venezuela. I mean, that is a huge issue in Trinidad, for example.
It is.
The flows in Guyana are nowhere near as large as Trinidad. When you look at the border between Venezuela and Guyana, it's very much in the hinterland and much more difficult terrain. However, those communities along that border are villages of 500-600 people. So if 100 Venezuelans show up, that puts a tremendous demand on the health services, the food supply, and so on, which is happening. We met with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who took us through this very geographically, or very graphically, and showed us where he had been and visited and found those things. Those communities do struggle to get education and health services. That's one of the things that the government is targeting to do spend a lot on developing the hinterland. So the Venezuelan migrants have putting some pressure on those outer communities, and there is some migration in Georgetown. Now, as you say, would Venezuela be a labor channel? Possibly. The language will be a barrier to overcome, possibly. But I think the government has been focusing very much now in terms of what they shared with us and in their policy statements about meeting skills gaps and labor gaps through expansion to CARICOM. I mean, that's where they're focusing.
Okay.
At this time. Now, whether it will always stay there or not, I'm not sure.
Right.
Before we leave the topic of Venezuela, I've gotten some questions about what risks the IMF has perceived as far as the border dispute with Venezuela and interruptions that could mean for the development of the oil sector in Guyana. If you could comment on that at all.
As far as we know, the Venezuelan claim is going through the appropriate international channels. The oil companies certainly have no concerns about any negative impacts for them in terms of their oil production in Guyana and property rights and that kind of thing with respect to Venezuela. So I don't think there's any perceived risk, certainly that is expressed to us, to the expansion and development of the oil sector within the territorial boundary of Guyana coming from Venezuela. And people expect whatever claims there are to continue to go through the standard international arrangements for these things. I didn't find that either at the government side, and I certainly didn't find it from the oil company side.
Arnold, you talked about oil accounting for 40% of GDP. And so I've gotten some questions about some of the different, like the multiplier effect from oil into the economy and what different types of investment would be needed or required in order to actually achieve that forecast that you have right now for the oil sector accounting for 40% of GDP.
Okay, we did these estimates. I mean, these estimates are a guide. They're not rules of science. They are a guide. We said that the oil, in our staff report, we point out the oil sector is projected to grow rapidly to around 40% of GDP by 2024. We expect additional fiscal spending between 2020 and 2024 per year of about 6.5% of GDP, in additional fiscal spending of non-oil GDP, that is. So every year between 2020 and 2024, we're expecting about 6.5% of non-oil GDP in additional spending. We expect this to improve non-oil GDP growth by about 3.5 percentage points on average. That's based on a multiplier of about 0.53 that we use for some of these Caribbean countries. That's how we arrived there. You would notice we place a lot of emphasis on the non-oil GDP and the non-oil fiscal sector because it's very important that you don't allow your gauge and your indicators of the economy to be drowned out by oil. So we're still looking at what is the relationship between spending, fiscal spending, and the expansion of non-oil GDP. What we discussed earlier was that we want to see the diversification of the economy around oil or away from oil, around oil certainly, to expand and the non-oil economy to grow while the oil economy is expanding. And that is very much going to rely upon the infrastructure investments we make, and secondly, the quality of social spending and the quality of the structural reforms. Those three areas have to be tackled in a concerted way to ensure that the non-oil economy expands over the next 7th decade, while the oil economy becomes very large.
I just wanted to clarify, Arnold. So the fiscal multiplier you're using for non-oil fiscal spending relative to non-oil GDP is 0.53.
Yes.
That's correct. Okay, thank you. I guess maybe we have time for one more question.
Oh, I think that we can do two. Do you think that you guys can do two?
If Arnold can do two.
I'm right here.
Okay, let's
Arnold,
go.
What sectors do you think that the government will take a role in continuing to develop, like the sugar industry or rice industry or areas where they've had an influence in the past? And where do you see that the private sector will really lead development?
Well, I think when we spoke with the government, they were very, very keen about expanding agriculture. Very, very keen about that. Mm-hmm. Guyana has, other than sugar, Guyana has a fairly strong agricultural sector. They felt that improving connectivity through roads and other things was important to developing distribution channels so that agricultural output can be distributed across the country and particularly the main city areas. So I see them continuing to spell that out. You know, the Green Strait Development Strategy, which guides the government's activities, talks a lot about that. And these are some of the key priorities they have there. The private sector is involved in some of the commodity production. I mean, the local private sector, obviously the foreign private sector is involved in that. But, you know, the private sector, you have medium-sized gold producers which are involved. Guyana is just, I think, the diamond industry is an industry there that is also growing. I think there is private sector involvement in that. But I would expect the private sector to expand in the financial sector, to expand in the commercial and real estate sectors, to expand, if possible, in export agriculture. So I see the private sector's role deepening in the economy. It's going to be important that small and medium-sized enterprises get more integrated into the economy, and that sector grows. So I see across a broad base of activities a role for the private sector. With respect to sugar, the government is, we spoke to Guy Suko, and NISIL is involved in the restructuring of the sugar industry in Guyana. there is an expectation Guyana will continue to maintain a sugar industry. It's a question of getting it be more efficient and to be more cost effective in that way, and so on. So I expect the outcome to be a stronger private sector, more deeply involved across a wide range of activities. And when we met the Private Sector Commission and we met other private sector bodies, they are very keen to play such a role.
That's good to know.
Okay, if you'll give me this last question, and then I'll turn it back to Marla. Arnold, given that a very significant oil industry will emerge, is there anything that you're hearing in terms of the geopolitical forces or key private sector investments or risks that could come into play for Guyana that you'd just like to leave everyone today as a takeaway of something to watch out for?
Well, I think the immediate future is going to be important. Obviously, there's an election. When the election is over, I think it's important that whoever the government may be makes it very clear what the policy framework in Guyana is in terms of the management of the oil wealth, in terms of the medium-term fiscal framework, the targets they expect to achieve, that their commitment to strengthening the governance institutions that we discussed earlier. I think the international community, the Guyanese community, and the regional community would want to hear a very clear policy direction forward for Guyana. Obviously, the existing government has really spelled out quite a bit of that. So if they are returned, one would expect that there's some continuity. But if the opposition is successful, then I'm sure that they will take the opportunity to do that. I think it's important that in the first few years that the economic management is prudent, while at the same time, as we discussed, there's sufficient room to start meeting well justified expectations for improved standards of living and social sector in Guyana. I think it's going to take some discipline. As I said, I thought the stakeholders were all very vigilant to that, and they have a key role to ensure that there is discipline. And of course, the CARICOM region has a role to play in terms of helping to Guyana to meet its needs, its own needs, and working with them as they try to chart a course forward for a new future. I think CARICOM countries have an important role to play in that because it will benefit them as well. One cannot state strongly enough the importance of regionalism to CARICOM countries, particularly in the 21st century as you move into a new global era and so on. Small states have no option but to collaborate more closely with each other. I think Guyana provides an opportunity, another opportunity. There are already others that exist for CARICOM, but Guyana provides another opportunity for the region to do that, and I really hope that they grasp it.
I agree with you, Arnold. I could not have said it better, and I could not have ended on a better note. I really feel like, Guyana is just one of the many. Climate change, of course, being a huge issue that we rally around, and correspondent banking, another huge issue that we rally around. But what's happening in Guyana and the fact that Guyana can really make a huge transformation for the improvement of its people, I think that's something that the whole region, and if not the wider world, is watching very closely. All eyes are on Guyana, and it's a good opportunity for the region to rethink the whole issue of integration and how we can help each other and support each other going forward. I guess, Melissa, we can wrap up here, but before we do that, Arnold, I can't thank you enough. I think this has been the most comprehensive and fulsome discussion that I have had on Guyana in a very long time, and I know that the audience is very appreciative of having you and your time and your level of expertise and your experience, not just on regional CARICOM issues, but as you draw an experience of Ghana as well, and you being the resident representative there, when they found oil, of course, will support the work that you do in Guyana. And we are very grateful that you spent this time with us and for the support of yourself and the fund as well in having these types of discussions and bringing these issues and ideas and your expertise to our audience. We really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much. And we look forward to many more.
Thank you very much, Marla. It was a pleasure to be here. Very interesting questions, both from yourself and the audience. It's a wonderful country and a wonderful set of people, and we can only wish the best.
It is. Yeah, I do wish the best for them. I hope it doesn't get too crowded the next time I want to go on a holiday. That's the only thing I'm hoping. But thank you again, and thank you to our audience for spending this time this morning with us. We really appreciate it, and see you next time on the next webinar.